parents fail to like and subscribe to Miniature Dork Universe,
Hey Mac, let's shoot those sons of bitches.
you won't pay the ultimate price for your treachery. You can't stop the tsunami of excellence. Dorkloids can't stop us.
Oh no, we're screwed, ain't we?
Hello friends, and welcome back once again to another round of Miniature Dork Universe. Today I'm going to show you how you can make this kind of rubble here with some cork and some paint and a coffee grinder to embellish all of your terrain projects, or you can just use it as a scatter for your terrain layouts on your game table like this. And it just gives it that little added element of realism, but it also can create like rough ground and things that are hard for vehicles to cross and for infantry to move through. So it has a few different functions. Also, you can add your own colors to it. So whatever you're using to paint your terrain, you just mix that in with your cork bits so that in the end, you'll end up with things such as this. Today I'll be working on these Italian buildings. They are in 12mm scale, and they're going to go with my O-group stuff. I'm doing sort of like a Operation Avalanche type game, although they could be used just as easily for Sicily. In these pictures you can see that I've adhered some of the rubble to the actual terrain piece, but I also scattered a bunch on the ground. And it's kind of like a cool way to sort of transition your actual terrain components in with everything else to sort of blend everything together. For my first step, I'm going to cut out some bricks with the cork. This is probably the longest and most tedious step, but I usually do things like this and listen to a podcast or something while I'm doing it, or listen to music or whatever. But you're going to want to slice out bricks or stones to the scale of the buildings, obviously, that you're going to be using the rubble with. So I'm using an Olfa knife here with a heavier blade that you can break often. You want to use a really sharp blade. So as soon as you see it starting to get dull and pull on the cork, just break it off to the next and make sure you keep that good and sharp. And so if you're doing bricks, obviously, you're going to make them all the same size. In my case, I'm doing a stone Italian building, so they can be random sizes. So I'll carefully cut away, and I will emphasize careful. Let's not slice our fingertips off, because we're going to look mighty stupid if we do that. And once I've painstakingly cut all these down into little stone sizes to scale with the building, and you can just measure it against the actual building, I put all the stones together for now in one of these. It's like a tinfoil muffin tray that you would just get at a, any baking supply place or grocery store or whatever, and just fire them all in there. Then get a bunch of cork scraps and a coffee grinder. Make sure the coffee grinder is clean. It probably doesn't matter. And then stuff all of your cork in the coffee grinder when your wife isn't looking. And then we're going to grind the shit out of it like a true to form savage. Keep grinding her up and check it periodically to make sure you get it to the sort of texture that you want. Once you have it ground to the consistency you need, pick out any bits that might be a bit too large. There's bound to be some in there. And then pour them all into one big pot like this. And have about 4 or 5 or even 6, depending on how many colors you want to use. That's how many of these foil baking trays you want. See, here's a big chunk. We'll piss him off over here. And yeah, just sort of skim through, make sure there's nothing too big. As you break it down into smaller cups, though, you'll see big stuff that you can get rid of. And then get your bricks here. Then I also grind up a bunch of wood. So this is like coffee stir stick, little dowels, some veneers that I have that I got at the dollar store. And I put in some cork too, because if you just put in the wood, it won't have enough volume in there or stuff to break it down into these small splinters. So yeah, stuff in your wood, stuff in a bit of cork, and then grind it again until you get it to the size and consistency that you want. Then we're going to mix our bricks and our stone rubble stuff into equal parts into the 4 different trays. A little scoop like this is always helpful for sort of scooping out equal parts and pouring them into the different pans. So the bricks and the ground up rubble will kind of go together, but I'm going to put the wood in a pan by itself and do that sort of like a brownish, wood-like color to mix in. And I don't want too many of my stones, like the cork that was in with the wood. It's going to get brown too. So I don't want too many of those stones that color. So yeah, I'm going to put all the wood stuff into one pan. To add color, I use these cheap sort of craft acrylics. Things like Color Factory, Deco Art, Craft Smart, and Folk Art. These things are really cheap. Like the big bottle there is $1.99. I think some of these things were 99 cents at an army surplus, so you can get these for cheap. The other thing I like about them is they're a slightly different color palette than your Vallejo paints or whatever, your Game Workshop or whatever era, or if you're doing sci-fi or whatever. You'll be using like nice quality, hobby paints for those. And these you can use easily for terrain, and it's a slightly different color palette. And there's also, between even these 4 different manufacturers here, there's literally hundreds of colors that you can have. So it gives you a wide spectrum, and then when you start mixing them, it just gets even more crazy. So it's a good idea to use these. And I find terrain doesn't get handled in the same way as your, the figures and the tanks and the infantry stands. So, you don't need that really good quality paint really for doing terrain. In fact, the kind of watery, it's a little bit watery and washy, like it actually ends up looking pretty good, I find. Because you add washes and a lot of dry brushing and whatever, you build up a lot of layers, and I just find this stuff ends up looking really good. My first color is going to be this Deco Art Pebble. So it might not look like it in the picture, but the squared off stone bits are mixed in with the rubble bits here. It's kind of hard to see here, but you'll see it once it's on the actual terrain piece. So pour a glob in. I put some of this Liquitex flow improver in. You just need a drop. It's very concentrated. I think I put 2 drops in. And then I'll mix it with a bunch of rubbing alcohol, because the rubbing alcohol will help it dry a bit faster. So put some of that in, and then just start mixing it up and mix it until it gets thoroughly mixed through. Oh yeah, sorry, I also add a bit of water. Add your water, get your mixing stick, and then just keep mixing it until that paint gets all the way through. Whoops, my name Ryan. And just keep mixing it up until it mixes all the way through. And something that's kind of cool is you also get a bit of the cork color coming through. And the cork is actually a nice color, whether you're doing like bricks or sort of more tan colored Mediterranean stonework like I'm doing. It's nice having that little bit of cork color coming through. And so within your different colors, you also have variations within those colors too. So it just helps to add to the overall realism of this. So yeah, just keep mixing it in. And also make sure that you use colors that sort of contrast with each other. Don't have them too close. You know what I mean? So as you mix the different colors together, you get more and more sort of body to it. It looks more, it looks natural, you know, and it looks, when you attach it to your terrain, it's going to look like you painstakingly painted each separate little color in, and that's going to be kind of impressive. And here they are all mixed up into the different batches, the different colors. And as you can see down at the bottom here, the wood is all together. And yeah, just make sure the colors aren't too close to one another so that they really contrast. They're going to look really nice. And at this point, they're ready to put in the oven. I put it in the oven at 200 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, Canada is a metric country, but for some fucked up reason, a lot of our ovens are in Fahrenheit. So I'm not sure what that is in Celsius, but I'm sure you could figure that out. It's not very high. And I leave it in for a good couple hours. This technique isn't my own creation. I learned about this from somebody. There was a forum called the Guild. Now it's the Wargamers forum. But there was a guy on the Guild, and I can't remember his name, so sorry if you're out there. But he was doing this, and he was using an actual kiln to heat it. I don't have a kiln, and I don't want to pay for the electricity to operate a kiln, so I just fired it in the oven. And it might still use a little bit of electricity, but probably not as much as a kiln. And I'm actually not sure. Like, a kiln is usually for something where you're going to use a lot of heat. So I can't remember if he was using lots of heat, but I just use low heat and keep it in the oven until it's nice and dry. Here's one of the colors that I've just taken out of the pans. You've got to sort of crumple it up. It sort of clumps together, so you got to kind of break it apart to get it nice and small again. So yeah, I'm just going to add each color to this box until they're all added together and just mix them all in. Here's what it looks like in the pan after it's come out of the oven and it cooled down a bit to handle. It never really gets that warm. You can pretty much handle it right out of the oven, but I let it cool down a little bit. And yeah, I'm sort of just rubbing it around, breaking the part or the pieces apart. And oops, see, they want to kind of fly everywhere like a bit of a dick, but just chuck them back in and sort of work it. And then in layers, I'm going to sort of pour it out into a box and just keep breaking up the bigger chunks. There'll be some stuff that's literally stuck to the sides, almost like if you burn something in the oven. It doesn't get burnt, but it does stick to the sides. But yeah, if you just crumple it up like between your thumb and forefinger, just break it apart like that, the square pieces will stay square and the other little chunks will break off. And you know, it'll end up looking like it did before you baked it, except this time it's got a color to it. And as you can see, some of the cork color is still shining through, which is great. You know, it just gives it all that variation. And so when you mix it all together, again, it looks like you did some amazing wicked paint job, but really you just ground up some cork and fired it in the oven. So here I'm putting it in a different box, but ultimately I'll put all of these things in the same box, obviously, and mix the colors together. See, this is the stuff that's sort of crusty and stuck on, and I'm just sort of rubbing it off with my fingertip. You don't have to go super hard with it either. Just keep working it till it comes off, and it will. And you'll get this small amount of cork that I used, you get a lot of rubble. Yeah, so it's kind of cool too. Because when you use this as scatter on a table, chances are you're not going to get 100% of it back. So if you have a big pile of it, it's kind of nice. And here it is all mixed together. And as you can see, it looks really wicked. And yeah, I'm pretty pleased with how this stuff looks. So the final step that I'm going to do is I'm going to add some stuff that'll look like the plaster on the walls broken off. So we have the wood for all the framing and everything in there. the only thing that's left is the plaster. Or if you have a stucco building, the stucco on the outside, I'll actually use plaster, and I'll paint one side of the plaster the same side as, or the same color as the building, and then break it all up and throw a bit of that in. Not as much as the rest of it. It's not going to be as predominant as the bricks and stones, but just having a little bit of that in there will look great. And so the building that I'm doing has white plaster walls that I painted sort of an off-white color. So I'll put a thin layer of plaster down, and then I'll paint the off-white color on one side and then break it up and chuck it in. To do that, I just use a bit of this cheapy plaster of Paris and a medicine cup. Oh, and I have a plastic lid. That's when I'm going to pour the like a thin layer of the plaster in. You want a really thin layer and just let it dry on the lid, and then it'll just crumble apart really easily, which is great. This is what you want to do. Mix in a small amount of plaster. You're not going to want too much, like I said. This isn't going to be like the predominant part of your rubble. This is just going to be, you know, little bits and pieces scattered through. And because a lot of it's going to be white, you don't want tons of it in there. But the fact that it's white, it's going to show up really, really well, obviously, against all the other colors. And try not to be a dork. Well, how can you try not to be a dork in Miniature Dork Universe? I'll rephrase that. Be a dork. Be a dork and spill shit everywhere. Say some bad words, maybe drink a beer or something. Punch an inanimate object. All of these things are ingredients to the success story, you know. At least each success story takes at least 2 or 3 bad words, and you might have to like pound the table a couple times and listen to some aggressive music or something. Yeah, and I'm just going to add water in with the eyedropper, and we'll mix all that up. And when it's all mixed, I'm going to pour it out onto that lid in a nice thin layer. And here we go, all mixed up. And just pour that sucker down. And probably I don't need to be too anal about getting it all out of there, but we're only going to use a little bit. And then mix it around until you get a small layer. And as you see, I've done this plaster quite thin. I could have framed that a little bit better in the center, but again, this is Miniature Dork Universe, and so dorks tend to be a little bit off sometimes. So yeah, but I think you get the point. As you can see, I'm just going to get it as thin, and because it's so watery, when it dries it's going to be a lot thinner even than what you're seeing here. But definitely you want to spread it out and get it nice and thin, and then just let it dry. When the surface was still a little bit moist, I painted the wall color on one side. So yeah, I wanted one side to look like the old sort of, you know, dirty plaster wall, and then of course the inner stuff is going to be a brighter color of white. But when you do that paint coat on when it's still a bit wet with acrylic paint, it really soaks right into the surface, so you get a pretty hardcore paint. That's kind of what they used to do in the old days when they were doing frescoes. They would use egg tempera on wet plaster. It's sort of the same idea. And this is what it looks like when it's bone dry. And this piece is actually a little bit thick, but there are some really thin pieces. There's some parts that are thick that I'm just going to pull out of here. But once you break it up, you know, you can see you're going to get those little broken bits. And I probably won't use all of this because I don't want to go overboard. I just want little bits of this showing through. But there's my rubble, there's my stuff, and we'll just start to mix it together. And this is what it looks like as I start to mix it in. And of course I'm going to shake it all up so it mixes in sort of evenly. And even sort of the powdery stuff is going to go through and add even more sort of color elements to it. So it ends up looking pretty legit. So now that we have all of our different elements mixed in, I'm ready to move on to my Italian terrain piece. So what I did, I looked at pictures of actual villages in Italy, and I wanted to go with a village that wasn't completely devastated by aerial bombing or an artillery barrage, but with some battle damaged buildings and some destroyed buildings. And so there was a lot of great images of the actual thing that I sort of worked from. And that was pretty good. So first I put all of the grass and the plant, vegetation in, and then I'll put that rubble around the building. I could have spread the rubble onto the stone, like the cobblestone sort of courtyard back there, but I wanted to keep it clear for infantry. So, that's not the most realistic, but you got to make some compromises. I wanted some areas to put my infantry. So I'm just going to use Mod Podge and spread that on, and then use my shovel to sprinkle the rubble, and I'll do that in layers until it's built up to a point where I'm satisfied. So the next step, I'm going to put some, like a watered down PVA, or in this case I'm just going to use Mod Podge for this too. I'll water it down just to seal this in, and then I will give it a wash. I got some MIG ammo wash for Panzer Gray. That's what I ended up using, and it looked pretty good. And then I gave it a dry brush with a very light sandy color. I wanted to make the stones have a bit of a tan sort of tint to it, because the stones in Italy are more of a tan color, grayish tans. And so yeah, I'll get on to that. What I'm going to do is use watered down PVA like this. And first I'm going to hit it with flow improver. So if you've seen my videos already, you've seen me use this, but it's just a Liquitex, fine art product. And you put 1 drop to 20 drops of water. I just make a spray bottle, and here I'm spraying it onto the area. Then I'm going to seal down. I haven't sealed the grass yet either, so I'll spray it onto that. And then once I get that good and soaked, I'm just going to get an eyedropper and see how it just spreads out into the, if I hadn't have put that flow improver on, it wouldn't soak into it, and it wouldn't start to disperse the way it is here. It would just sort of make, like a water drop on top of it, and the surface tension won't break. But the flow improver breaks the surface tension of water, so it's more like a oil. And as you can see, it does a really good job. So I'll go around and seal all that down, and then when it's done, I'll give it the wash and the dry brush. And you've seen the pictures at the beginning, that's how it's going to turn out. But when I close up, I'll show a picture of the final product again, just so that you can see. But yeah, I left that courtyard sort of free of rubble so that I could put an infantry base and maybe like a, like a support weapon in there. I don't put tons of infantry in one building, so if the way I have it, if there's an infantry stand in there, it just means it's occupied that area. But you're not going to have more than a squad in buildings like this. Maybe a squad and a support weapon like a machine gun, but any more of that, you've got your guys too close together, and really you want to have them more dispersed with interlocking fields of fire. Here's a still of the final. So this is after the wash was added and the dry brush. And it was very minimal. I just hit the wash in areas where I thought I wanted to see more texture, and same with the dry brush. I dry brush just spots where I wanted a bit more contrast maybe. And as you can see, it looks quite good. It's actually pretty busy in this picture, but it should be, right? Like that's the look you're going for. So the damage on the building across I put in with an engraver's pen, and that's going to be my next video. I'm going to show you how I fix, crappy casts, like crappy resin casts, and also how I add my own texture with the engraving pen. Because then you can do things like this, have this little story where this building's been hit. Maybe a target was spotted in the building, and so it was hit with artillery, and the force of the shrapnel has damaged its neighboring building. And that kind of thing sort of looks cool. Anyway, that's going to do it, friends. We've finished another Miniature Dork Universe. So as always, thanks for watching. And if you did like and subscribe, despite the threats from the aliens, thanks. And I hope to see you soon. That's all for now. Davy's out.